What's up, Vetters? Patrick here with Vetted. I have some bombshell news coming directly from Hal Puthoff, who was recently featured on Joe Rogan. So let's jump into these clips because, it's Hal Puthoff. Now, before we begin, please hit that like button, Vetters. That really helps out the videos. And, of course, if you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button. Put out new videos about the UAP topic every week. Let's do this. This first clip is Hal Puthoff talking about the number of craft that the U.S. has in their possession. Let's take a look.
How many of these crashed crafts do you estimate there are that human beings have recovered?
More than 10.
More than 10.
More than 10.
How many of them are in possession of people in the United States?
I meant more than 10 in possession of the United States.
What about worldwide?
Worldwide?
Do we have any data on that?
We have data, but it's classified. There's no way to really talk about it.
But so there's more, though. You could safely say it's not just the ones in the United States.
Not just the ones in the United States. And these...
are they equally distributed?
Actually, I don't know for sure in terms of data. I mean, we have our best data, of course, on our own retrievals.
But more than 10 retrieved in the United States.
More than 10.
All right, so he's saying we have, more than 10 in our possession, U.S. possession, but it's classified to talk about the other countries', stockpile of UFOs. I do find that interesting. Why is it not classified to talk about how many the U.S. has in their possession? So I'm a little confused on that. And what exactly are we saying? Are there hundreds worldwide? Right? I don't know. You hear about multiple UFOs being shot down every year within the UFO community. So more than 10, I mean, it sounds like there's more than 1,000. I don't know. All seems very strange. Hard to tell, are they all in working condition? Are they full intact UFOs? Like, what does that mean? We have more than 10 UFOs. What do they designate as a UFO? It's literally unidentified flying object. So it's unidentified. So how are you identifying it? I don't know. Yeah, maybe it's all semantics and I'm reading too much into it, but very interesting. I don't know. So, all right, let's move on to the next clip. Let me know what you think of Hal Puthoff's comments about, the U.S. is in possession of more than 10 craft, right? So let's move on to this next clip of Bob Lazar, right? So as you may or may not know, I think the top interview, if it's not the top, it's one of the top interviews that Joe Rogan's ever done is with Bob Lazar and Jeremy Corbell, right? And Joe Rogan is a huge Bob Lazar fan and actively supports him on the channel. So he has Hal Puthoff sitting in front of him for the first time ever and definitely asked Hal Puthoff about Bob Lazar. And this is what Hal Puthoff had to say.
What is your take on Bob Lazar?
Well, we looked into the Bob Lazar story, and but only from a certain relatively superficial level. Looked at we found out what his clearance levels supposedly were, and so on, which came back saying it was not high enough to be doing what he says he was doing. On the other hand, it may just simply be, it was better than that, but we didn't have the access to see that. So when I hear his physics descriptions, it's a puzzle. It seems not exactly as I would anticipate might be the technology behind the craft, but I can't absolutely write him off. So it's an enigma, and I don't have any hard data to prove one way or the other. So it's I know you've talked to him. And,
it's a fascinating puzzle.
It is a fascinating puzzle
because that would be the place. S4 would be the place where they would do that kind of work. I mean, if you wanted to do something like that in complete privacy and secrecy, you'd do it in the middle of the Nevada desert, very protected.
That's true. Right.
Outside of Area 51.
So even when people that have high clearances go and say, well, tell me about this, what's behind this? Who knows? If it's a special access program, an SAP, it might be, say, no, we're going to tell you that, he didn't do anything of significance here. In fact, he might have done something of significance. There's just no way of telling from the outside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the actual generator, the thing that powers the craft that Lazar talked about, what was your take on that? This idea that it was element 115, that when it encounters high radiation, it has some sort of an anti-gravitational effect, some warp effect.
Well, there are two aspects. One is, what is the material or mechanisms that generate the effects? And then the other is, are the effects being described reasonable descriptions of the kind of effects you think are associated with such craft? On the element 115, as you know, in the general scientific community, we've seen element 115, but it's very short-lived. So it's hard to evaluate that, and at this point, there's no evidence that's it.
So it was we should explain to people, it was theoretical at one point until they detected it using, was it a Large Hadron Collider or another particle collider?
Right now, I think it was a particle collider in Soviet Union or in Russia.
And it's very short-lasting. Yeah. But the idea is that what Lazar was in possession of, or what the craft was powered by, was some sort of a stable version of element 115.
That's what he says. So, in general, it was known that, and predicted, that there was an island of stability, as we call it, on some of these higher elements in the periodic table that are beyond uranium and so on. But really no data predicted as to what their lifetimes would be. And so element 115 is in that bunch, and when he first discussed it, it hadn't been seen yet.
Or this is way back in 1989.
Way back, that's right. But eventually that element was detected, although the version of it that was detected had a very short lifetime. But of course, there may be some other isotope of that element that could have a long lifetime. Who knows? So it's just hard to evaluate. So it sits in my gray box, as I say.
All right, let me know what you think of those comments from Hal Puthoff about Bob Lazar. It doesn't sound like he's completely negating his story, right? But it doesn't sound like he's completely supporting it either. As he just said, he puts it in the gray box, which I agree. In this field, you need to do something like that. You don't necessarily have to make a decision about everybody and everything in the UFO topic, right? Every story you hear, every encounter, every photo you see, every video. Sometimes it's best just to go, I don't know, and just kind of put it on the back burner, or as Hal might say, the gray box. So very interesting. Let's move on. All right. This next part is, to me, one of the most interesting parts of the interview that most people are not covering or talking about at all. And that is Hal Puthoff talking about this new UFO documentary that's coming out called The Age of Disclosure. It's this top secret UFO documentary that was shot over the last 2.5 years by producer and first-time director Dan Farah, who got together, as Hal will put it here, right, about 38 former government officials all together in one documentary that's supposed to be game-changing, right? And as Hal Puthoff puts it, this will be disclosure on steroids, right? So let's jump in and see what more he says about this documentary. Now, it turns out, it's also revealed in this clip that Joe Rogan has already seen the documentary. Right. So that's kind of interesting, too. And Joe gives his take on what he thinks about the age of disclosure in this documentary. Let's take a look.
And when you think about, these days, well, suppose we have some kind of disclosure. What are these companies going to do? They've been hiding things, or parts of the government have been hiding things.
Misappropriating funds, lying to Congress.
Lying to Congress. So you can see why it's such a big problem at this point.
Well, that was that disclosure documentary that I saw you in as well that appeared at South by Southwest, which was excellent. What is it called?
It's called The Age of Disclosure.
Amazing
And
documentary.
It's an amazing documentary.
Really hope that gets released somewhere big, like Netflix or something like that, so people can see it.
I think Dan Farah, who's the director and producer of that, by the way, a very well-known producer. You know, he collaborated with Steven Spielberg on Ready Player One, which is the big hit, and so on. And the approach he used, which is really very clever, he contacted people like me, people like Lou Elizondo, on and on and on, and said, you know, many of you don't want to come out really and reveal too much, podcast by podcast by podcast. So tell you what, my goal, he says, I'm going to approach 38 of the maximum insiders. And by maximum insiders, I mean it includes people like, I don't know, Senator Rubio, of course now Secretary of State, Clapper, who's, you know, and I'm going to get all of you to collaborate on saying what your involvement was to the degree you can, and, you know, not say something and end up going to jail. And then we'll put out maximum disclosure evidence all at one time in this film. And it'll include people coming forward like Jay Stratton, who is head of the UAP task force. He's been involved in this field for 16 years. By the way, he has a book about to come out also, which will really be a disclosure. So anyways, we'll put this together. We won't talk about it along the way. And so 38 of us ended up being interviewed for the film, telling whatever role we felt we could tell. So, in fact, when that film comes out, that's going to be disclosure on steroids, I think. That's going to be the maximum. And, well, you saw the film, so you know it's pretty revealing.
It's very well done.
Yeah.
So what do we think? Will this documentary be disclosure on steroids? And what does he mean by disclosure exactly? It isn't really defined because of, as I've come to find out, disclosure means a lot of things to a lot of people. Now, he also states that Jay Stratton, who is heavily featured in the trailer for The Age of Disclosure and in the documentary itself, right, has a new book coming out that will also be disclosure, right? So it's very interesting. I would love for them to define this word and what they mean by that exactly, but I am very excited about this documentary, and Joe Rogan seems to think it's really good, right? He likes the documentary, but he also doesn't jump on the, yeah, this will be disclosure, this will be whatever. So that's kind of interesting. He didn't give really more opinion about it. He says, well, you know, good and well put together and great or whatever, but right, he didn't really go into any more detail. Maybe he's not allowed to. I don't know. So anyway, look, I'll put a link in the description to the full Hal Puthoff interview on Joe Rogan. Otherwise, that's it for today's video. Thank you so much, Vetters. We'll see you on the next one. Remember, every day's a gift, y'all. Peace.